Welcome, everybody, to our next webinar for the St. John's CRS Global Campus Committee this spring. This time, I am simply going to welcome you, and we will begin with prayer, and then I will introduce Dr. Fred Cucuzzelli, the Chair of Government and Politics, to introduce our speaker. And then once his presentation's done, we have three wonderful St. John's undergraduates from St. John's College and the Tobin College of Business who will ask questions and respond. As we begin, as we always do with prayer, I ask that we all pause for a moment. Almighty God, through your Holy Spirit, you created unity in the midst of diversity. We acknowledge that human diversity is an expression of your manifold love of your creation. We confess that in our brokenness as human beings, we sometimes turn diversity into a source of alienation, injustice, oppression, and wounding. Empower us to recognize and celebrate differences as your great gift to the human family. Enable us to be the architects of understanding, of respect, and of love. Through the Lord, the ground of all unity, we pray. Amen. And so I turn it over to Dr. Fred Cucuzzelli.
Thank you, Megan. So I'm really very happy to introduce Dr. Stephen Schneck, in part because I remember Dr. Schneck when I was an undergraduate at Catholic University a long time ago. And I remember a very, very thoughtful and really something that had a big impact on me, a course on actually the philosophy of Marxism. And I wrote a paper about praxis. I'm sure you don't remember it, but
I remember
it. And it made a big impact on me. And I really enjoyed how he managed a very small and really interesting seminar. So when Megan said, with Dr. Stephen Schneck is coming and asked me to do the introductions, I was like, that would be fantastic. And again, since then, Dr. Schneck, as Stephen, has done some tremendous work after leaving Catholic University in 2018, where he had been a professor, right? Obviously, department chair. He was the dean. He's worked at the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies, where he was the founder there. Interesting work on Catholic Climate Covenant, which I've been perusing the website of, and is, sort of pulling together spiritual approaches to climate. Part of the Catholic Mobilizing Network, right, which does work on to end the death penalty, and just a really engaged, what to me is really interesting for students to see, an engaged scholar who is also engaged in spirituality and pulling together those sides of the spiritual, the academic, and the activist. I think it's a great example for all of us, particularly because you've also been tremendously successful at it, right? It is all the way up to the Barack Obama White House, where you were a member of the White House Advisory Council for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Participation, or Partnerships, rather. So it's great to see you again. It's been a while. And it's great to see just how much has come from your work over the years. And so I'll leave it to you to take it from there.
Fred, first of all, let me just say what a treat it is to be back with you after so many years. I do remember you. I don't remember that particular paper, but I do remember you very fondly, and I'm just delighted to see the many successes that you've had since leaving my classroom. I won't tell the students how many years ago. So just really, really, really grateful for this opportunity to be here, and I appreciate your kind introduction. I also want to thank Dr. Clark, Professor Clark's invitation came at a really opportune moment. I'm pleased to talk about my work at the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom and talk about religious freedom generally. And thank you for your prayer today too, Megan. I appreciate that as well. I thought I'd start with a little bit of discussion about the commission itself. So as Fred mentioned, I have been serving as chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and the commission itself is part of the legislative branch. It was created in 1998 by the IRF Act, the International Religious Freedom Act, which created the commission to serve as a watchdog on the work of the United States government to protect and promote religious freedom around the world. And so our job on the commission is to monitor religious freedom, not internally, not within the United States, but everywhere else in the world. And so, we monitor all of the countries of the world. This involves quite a bit of travel on our part. We travel to these countries to assess the condition on the ground. We work with the NGO community to learn from the civil society, what the situation is. We read government reports. We have the commission itself is composed of 9 commissioners. That it's bipartisan. I was appointed by President Biden in 2022. Other commissioners were appointed by Republicans, either in the Congress or now with the Trump presidency. There will be some being appointed by President Trump. But it's a privilege to be doing this work, and I have to say it's emotionally very difficult work. Many of my days are spent either hearing harrowing stories from victims who have been horribly abused, imprisoned, relatives murdered, dealing with refugees in refugee camps, as well as the other side is almost just as hard, being shouted at by foreign ministers in various countries around the world who complain about the fact that we are speaking truth to power and holding up their actions for the world to see. So this is the kind of work we do. Specifically, we make recommendations to the president, to the Department of State, to other government agencies like Commerce and Defense, and to Congress for laws and policies that the United States needs to implement in order to better protect and secure religious freedom around the world. So that's pretty much what the commission is about. Now, I thought maybe I'd turn to talk just a little bit about religious freedom itself. Under the law that established my commission, the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 that I mentioned before, we are required to use international standards to assess religious freedom in other countries. And this means we don't use U.S. foreign policy in our deliberations about these things, and we don't use Western values or American values. Instead, by design, we're required to use international law and things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that almost all of the parties to the United Nations have signed on to. Article 18, for example, of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights guarantees religious freedom to everyone on the planet. Under these provisions, religious freedom not only protects the freedom of religious communities as groups to engage in worship and other collective activities, it also affords every individual the right to hold or not to hold any religion or belief, and to manifest those beliefs either alone or in community, in public or in private. As such, religious freedom then is closely related to freedoms of conscience, expression, assembly, association. In fact, I would argue that it's an anchor right for human rights in general. It provides kind of the first touchstone by which we can then begin to consider all of the other human rights that are at issue. So religious freedom is not just for minorities. It affords members of a country's religious majority as well the freedom to debate or refuse to follow a dominant or majority interpretation of their religion. And religious freedom is not only for religious communities deemed traditional. It protects individuals and groups holding new beliefs whether they're polytheistic beliefs, non-theistic beliefs, or even atheistic beliefs. In fact, there's a wonderful word that my German colleagues that work in this international religious freedom space use for their, instead of talking about religious freedom, they talk about, well, I have to use a big fancy German word here, Weltanschauungsfreiheit, which means the freedom of worldview, the freedom to hold the whatever it is that allows you to make sense and understand the world and your place within it. That's really what religious freedom is about in the way that we think about it and in the way that international law talks about it. So, of course, it means protecting worshiping, but it means more than that. It also includes such things as wearing religious dress or not, wearing religious symbols or not, observing dietary restrictions, participating in rituals associated with certain stages of life, having access to property rights, for example, regarding places to meet for worship. It further includes things like the freedom to manage religious institutions, to possess and to publish and distribute religious literature, to provide religious education, to raise one's children as your religious teachings incline you. These are all part of the bigger picture of what religious freedom is about. It also involves the freedom to keep or to change religion or belief without coercion. This is a big issue around the world where there are many non-conversion laws in operation in a number of countries. And it includes the freedom to publicly express those beliefs, including to proselytize those beliefs. We might not like those people who come and knock on our door with religious literature, but nevertheless, it is their freedom guaranteed under Article 18 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights for people to be able to proselytize about their faith. Like any human rights, of course, freedom of religion or belief is not unlimited. However, the limits are very narrow and cannot be discriminatory. So under international law, restrictions on manifesting religion or belief must be shown to be necessary to protect public safety, perhaps, or order, the public order, or health restrictions. However, national security is not a valid ground for restricting religious belief, and neither is a state of emergency a legitimate ground for restricting religious freedom. Okay, now, why does religious freedom matter? Well, I've already told you that in many ways it's an anchor right or a foundation right for other human rights. Beyond that, there are a few other things. First of all, religion itself matters. About, this according to Pew Research, about 84% of the planet identifies with a religious group or another. And of the remaining 16% who say they are unaffiliated, many of them still report holding some religious or spiritual beliefs. And in many countries across the globe, individuals and communities face government restrictions on exercising their religion or belief, or face social hostilities involving religion or belief, or both. So you can see why it matters there. Secondly, religious freedom also matters for important practical purposes. Countries that protect the right to believe or not to believe, including members of majority faith, dissenters, religious minorities, and the non-religious, those countries, empirically, we find to be more stable, more peaceful, and more prosperous. And those without religious freedom, on the other hand, suffer from extremism, violence, and instability. Those with religious freedom, for the most part, tend to be among the United States allies around the world, whereas those without religious freedom, excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. Those without religious freedom are often some of the United States' most difficult nations around the world. So as a result, religious freedom is not only a matter of humanitarian concern, it's a matter of national, global, and regional security. So for very practical reasons, it's another reason why we like it. Now let me offer a bit of a global perspective on where things stand in regards to religious freedom. I have to say, we just literally, USERF just, the commission just released in the last couple of days its annual report, which is our yearly, we are required yearly by Congress to submit this report, which kind of is an assessment of the state of religious freedom everywhere. And what we have found, and this is for following a pattern that we've seen over the last decade, is an increasingly worsening situation for religious freedom really across the globe. We're seeing a spike or a wave of religious intolerance, of persecution, of discrimination on the basis of religion that is tremendously worrying. And this spike or rise or wave of religious persecution that we're seeing goes hand in hand with the decaying of democracy around the globe and the rise of authoritarianism around the globe. So there's a real correlation between political repression associated with authoritarianism and similar forms of government and the denial of religious freedom. So as religious freedom is denied, we see democracy waning and authoritarianism rising. The report that we just released identifies 17 countries as the worst actors. We call these countries of particular concern. Those, I'll go through some of those countries in a few minutes just to describe them. We also identify 11 countries as what we call special watch list countries. That's sort of like the second tier. For the very worst countries, these are countries that where religious freedom is threatened by laws that are, or policies that are egregious, violent, and systematic. And so that includes everything from imprisonment and rapes and tortures, disappearances, deaths, and so forth, to the control of religious newspapers, the control of religious services and such. So these are the very worst cases that we have out there. Special watch list, as I said, is the second tier. It satisfies two of the requirements by which we measure the very worst countries. In addition, we also track what are called entities of particular concern. So not countries, but rather groups who occupy some territory, such as Boko Haram or ISIS-K. These are examples of entities of particular concern, that threaten religious freedom around the world. In any country that we look at, religious persecution may arise from governmental action or from governmental inaction against abuses that might be carried out by private individuals or occurs within society generally. In terms of government action, some patterns are apparent among the world's worst abusers. The most serious government persecution is typically committed by authoritarian regimes or illiberal democracies, behaving in the following ways. First, they seek to eliminate or control religious beliefs or activities. Second, they seek to impose one particular interpretation of religion on everyone. Or third, they enforce laws and policies that involve the weaponization of religion for the purposes of religious nationalism. So those are kind of the three basic categories that we see among the worst perpetrators against religious freedom around the world. So I want to talk about each one of these three and use an example to illustrate them. So the first category, these are the governments that seek to eliminate or control all religion. And these would include governments such as China, Cuba, Eritrea, North Korea, Turkmenistan. I could give you some others as well, but you get the gist here. These are examples of this first type of abuse. These governments see religion as a rival source of authority or a rival source of loyalty or power, a threat, in other words, to the authoritarian government. As a result, what we note is that they may tolerate religious groups and they may tolerate some religious practices only to the extent that the government can control or subvert them. Unapproved religious activity in countries like these is criminalized and punished. So let me use China as an illustration here. China engages in what is called the sinification of religion. In other words, it's trying to have the Chinese government control all of the religions within its territory. So whether it's Buddhism or Catholicism or Confucianism or Protestantism, Islam, whatever these religions are, what the Chinese government has created, it has created its own Communist Party controlled versions of that religion. And these religions are allowed to practice, but their practices are very much managed and manipulated and controlled in order so that that practice of that religion supports the Chinese Communist Party. So, since St. John's is associated with the Catholic Church, let me note that the Catholic Church operates in China under this system. So it is, the Catholic Church exists, but it is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese Party has a role to play in selecting the bishops that the Catholic Church has. It has a role to play in the liturgy that the Catholic Church practices there. It has a role to play in where the Catholics are allowed to worship and so on and so forth. So the government, in essence, controls the religion. Outside of that, and there are what are called underground Catholics in China. Outside of that, those underground Catholics that aren't controlled by the state, they are persecuted and imprisoned and so on and so forth because they're not within the state-controlled religion. And the same thing would be true with Protestants. So Protestant churches, there are Protestant churches that exist under the sinification policies, but if they're not part of that, if it's a house church or Protestants operating outside of that, then they fall under then they become persecuted. And probably the worst examples that we see in China are what are occurring to the Uyghur Muslims and the Tibetan Buddhists. Both the Uyghur Muslims and the Tibetan Buddhists are experiencing what can only really be called cultural genocide, and in fact, in the case of the Uyghurs, actual genocide occurring there. So not only is the Chinese party attempting to control the religions here, but it's actually repressing the Uyghur Muslims and the Tibetan Buddhists within the territories that they operate. So this is an illustration, as I say, of that first kind of a case, that these are governments seeking to control or eliminate religion within their territories. The second category that we see around the world are governments that are enforcing a particular interpretation of religion. Now, these would include governments such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the de facto regime in the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These are examples of the second type. And if you think about what each of these has in common, more or less, they are theocracies. Pakistan, maybe less, Iran, maybe more, Saudi Arabia in the middle, Taliban, probably the worst possible case of a theocracy in operation. Governments like these enforce norms of a particular religion or a particular interpretation of religion. These governments enforce norms, as I said, but they enforce it on everybody. Some minority religious communities as groups may be tolerated. There are Zoroastrians in Iran. There are Jews in Iran, but they are tolerated and granted only very limited rights. But the individual right to religious freedom is not protected in these countries at all, especially for dissenting members of the majority faith or for those who are non-religious. Enforcement of criminal laws is done harshly to punish any perceived religious offense, such as blasphemy or apostasy in countries like this. We know, for example, let me use Iran as an illustration here. So we know, for example, that if a woman is not wearing a hijab in Iran, you can be arrested and you can be thrown in prison. You can be tortured just for not wearing, the appropriate religious garb. And if you're a dissenter, if you say something bad about the prophet, death penalties occur. And in fact, I think Fred mentioned, one of my other hats is that I'm concerned about the death penalty around the world. And Iran is one of the countries where we see the death penalty being employed regularly against religious dissenters within the country. So these are, as I said, the second category is kind of like a theocracy where we see religion imposed on everyone, and anyone who doesn't follow that particular religion falls under very harsh punishment. The third category that I want to mention is the one that where we see the greatest amount of, I hate to say it, call it growth, but this is where we see a real spike occurring. And these are governments that use religious nationalism in order to advance some political agenda. So examples like these would be Russia, where Putin uses the Russian Orthodox Church as a means of instilling religious nationalism for everything from support for the war in Ukraine to to a host of other horrible policies that the Putin regime is pursuing. India, where we see Prime Minister Modi and the BJP party advancing Hindu nationalism in a way that's increasingly excluding Muslims and Christians and Dalits and Sikhs and Parsis, from public life, squeezing them out in different ways. Or maybe the absolute worst example of this that we have right now is in Burma, or Myanmar, as it's somewhere called. In Burma, it's a Buddhist nationalism that has become so militant, of course, that it's essentially created a civil war against all of the other religious minorities in the country, driving the Muslim Rohingya from the country entirely, bombing Christian villages, and whether Catholic or Protestant, in different parts of the country. So it's a particularly horrific example. And there are other examples as well, maybe a little bit less horrific. Turkey, for example, we see this. Sri Lanka, we see a Buddhist nationalism of Turkey. Of course, it's an Islamic nationalism, and Christian nationalism is increasingly being seen around the world in different places as well. So Hungary is an example where Christian nationalism is being used by the regime of Viktor Orban in such a way to squeeze out of public life the religious activities of minority religions within the country, and being used in the same way for political purposes as we see in places like India and Russia. So those are the three basic categories by which we can see. And as I indicated, that last category is the one where we're seeing probably the greatest amount of spike or surging occurring around the world. In addition to all those categories, though, I should also probably mention at this time transnational repression, because this is another phenomenon that we're seeing rising in our current situation. Transnational repression are when governments try to repress religious opponents abroad. And transnational repression is practiced by countries like China, where we see here in this country, for example, I was just hearing a case from the Falun Gong. Here in Washington, the Falun Gong were going to do a ballet, and the Chinese government had its agents interfere with this ballet so that it wasn't able to be shown at the Kennedy Center. But China does this, Iran does this, Russia does this, Saudi Arabia does it, Turkey does it, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, I could go on. And India does this. I think you may be aware that in New Jersey, the Indian government was involved in an assassination plot that tried to kill a Sikh religious leader in the state of New Jersey. That's an example, a horrific example of transnational repression, where governments are actually going beyond their borders to repress religions that they view as a threat to their states. In addition to governments that actually abuse are actively involved in the abuse of religious freedom, we also see a number of cases where governments are allowing that kind of abuse to take place. And that too is of concern to us. So religious freedom violations may result from government inaction in the face of abuses carried out by private individuals or groups. Examples of this would be places like Nigeria. So Nigeria is probably the place in the world where Christians are under the most threat right now. Hundreds of Christians have been killed, just in the last 6 months or so. And here it's conflict between Fulani Muslim herders moving in from the Sahel region north of Nigeria, moving into Nigeria, and a conflict between that and the more agrarian Christian communities that have been settled before. In that conflict, we see violence on both sides, but particularly violence against a Christian population. And while the Nigerian government isn't itself involved in that activity, isn't it? In fact, tries to some extent to halt that kind of violence. But nevertheless, it's so unsuccessful that from the outside, it really does seem like the Nigerian government is not trying hard enough to arrest that. And so my commission, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, has put Nigeria now in the worst categories of offenders, not because of their actions, not because of the government's actions, but because of the government's inaction in addressing the abuses that are taking place within their territory. In terms of, I want to talk a little bit about victims in the time that's remaining. In terms of victims, there's no faith or no belief group that's immune to religious persecution. In some countries, members of majority faith are the primary victims of religious violations. For example, in Central Asia, which is a Muslim territory, Muslims are the main focus of much of the religious persecution that takes place. Vietnam is a majority Buddhist country, but the government targets independent Buddhists within the country. That said, it's for the most part, while there are these cases of the majority religion in the countries being targeted, religious minorities are perhaps especially vulnerable around the world. Followers of very small religions that are minorities everywhere are particularly at risk. And so the Baha'is around the world are persecuted in a number of countries, Iran and Yemen. Mandaeans and Yazidis are targeted in Iraq and Syria. The Hua and Cao Dai, small religious groups, are targeted in Vietnam. But even followers of larger religions are vulnerable minorities in some places. So Christians are vulnerable in the Middle East. Rohingya Muslims that I mentioned before, large minority that are being targeted in Burma, Uyghur Muslims and Tibetan Buddhists in China, Hindus in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Literally every religion someplace is persecuted. There are also minorities within minorities. So Christian communities in Middle Eastern countries include many different denominations, and sometimes there are tensions between those religious denominations. Member groups that are a minority within a majority also suffer religious freedom violations. for example, Shia and Ismaili Muslims in Saudi Arabia, Sunni Muslims in Iran, Ahmadis in Pakistan, and many other places. Similarly, non-Russian Orthodox Christians experience harassment and discrimination in Russia. Another vulnerable group is women. And I don't think this probably surprises any of us. Women are often the target for abuse in a number of secular circumstances as well, of course. But especially women who are members of religious minorities suffer around the world. Severe abuses against women include sexual violence, forced marriage, and forced conversions, forced abortions, limitations on marriage and childbearing. Especially egregious examples include atrocities perpetrated against Uyghur Muslims in China, against Rohingya Muslims in Burma, Yazidi women in Iraq and Syria. Women are also often restricted in how they dress around the world, either forced to wear religious garb or, as in the case of France, prevented from wearing religious garb, rather than being free to decide according to their own conscience. In addition, LGBTQ plus people experience egregious religious freedom violations in some places. For example, there are governments that impose harsh penalties, including the death sentence, against them under criminal laws that enforce particular religious interpretations. Non-religious individuals are often frequent victims of religious freedom abuses in the LGBT community, including prosecutions under blasphemy or anti-terrorism laws and extremist attacks. For those of us who seek to promote religious freedom for all, broader global trends are making the contemporary landscape even more challenging. In many countries, authoritarianism is on the rise and democracy is declining. In others, failing or failed states leave ungoverned territories where violent non-state actors like Boko Haram, for example, are free to operate. In still others, violent conflict is leading to horrific conditions for everyone, including religious communities. Meanwhile, pernicious forms of religious hatred, including anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bias, have surged in many places, especially in this past year since the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th of last year. In addition, the world is experiencing the largest displacement crisis ever recorded. We're talking about migration here, with the UN Refugee Agency estimating that in April of 2024, more than 120 million people globally have been forcibly displaced due to persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, and other serious disruptions to the public order. And in the midst of all of this, in the midst of all of the things that I've just mentioned, religious persecution is flourishing, is growing, is present in each of these cases. Well, I've talked quite a bit, and I've gone on at some length, but I think that you'll get the pretty ugly picture in at least in the gist from the comments that I've made. I'd be happy at this time to listen to any questions you might have, and perhaps some of the questions might allow me to explore some other topics that would be of interest to everyone. So thank you.
Thank you. That is it's a tough picture, right?
It's a worsening situation, and there's unfortunately not a lot of resolve either in the United States or in international organizations to address it.
Yeah, I think that sense of worsening is really it creates a real challenge and fitting it in with the bigger picture of the decline of democracy. But we have a couple of students from across the university who are sort of commentators. I'll give them a quick introduction. Sophia Feeney from I believe at Tobin, although an honorary Gov student, I think. In some ways, she's always at ours. She's always around. Nathaniel Langen, who is a student in government politics, right? And Emma McEachin, did I get that right? Who is a global development student. And so do you guys have any, you guys want to go first and give me a particular, um, okay, Sophia, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just thank you again for your time and all the really interesting insights. I feel like everybody can learn a lot from this, and it applies to beyond just religious freedom, but just general freedom. So I really resonated with those points. Just wanted to kind of touch on the religious nationalism that you had spoken about, and I was wondering, how does you and the commission think that played a role in the most recent election in the US and general US politics, and how can we kind of stray away from these type of political strategies? And then kind of an anecdote added on to that. Does the commission think that there could ever be a real separation between church and state, or is that kind of like an idealistic dream?
Huh. Well, let me deal with the last question. First of all, thank you for the question, Sophia. I appreciate it. Those are good questions. I'm going to dodge the internal United States election discussion just because I'm required in my job to kind of focus internationally. So I can kind of keep my distance from that. But I'm certainly willing to talk about religious nationalism and its implications generally. But let me go back to your first question about the separation between church and state. By and large, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is just our key criterion for assessing religious freedom around the world, it supports precisely a separation of church and state. It doesn't. I mean, it doesn't necessarily require an absolute separation. So we recognize that a state could very well have a state religion, but nevertheless, the general understanding of the rights of freedom of religion, the being free to change religion according to how you wish, freedom to believe or not to believe anything that you wish, practice as you wish. That way of thinking about the rights of religion is entirely consonant with the separation of church and state. And I think that there's a real fit between the idea of religious freedom as it's practiced under international law and exactly the kind of separation of church and state that you're hoping for. It's really, to the extent that there isn't that separation, then it becomes much more complicated for religious freedom to operate in the way that the UN Declaration on Human Rights expects it to operate. So that's a really good question. Whether it's a pipe dream that that there would ever be true separation of church and state, I don't know. I have to say, personally, I find inspiration in faith that is very useful and important in my engagement in political life, but that wouldn't mean that I would want my faith to be in charge of my political life. That kind of separation, I think, is critically important. Now, let me turn to your religious nationalism question. As I said, this is something that we are seeing spiking everywhere around the world. And I think that what we're seeing is a recognition by authoritarians and wannabe authoritarians that religion can be weaponized to advance a political agenda. That's really, I think, I don't think there's really much in the way of kind of organic religious nationalism that comes from below. I think what we're seeing more than anything else are very savvy political leaders from above recognizing, hey, I can use religion in order to mobilize population. I can use religion in order to sharpen polarizations to the advantage of my political party. That religious nationalism is spiking everywhere. And as I said, it goes hand in hand with rising authoritarianism and the decay of democracy. And you can look at Turkey, you can look at Hungary, you can look at India, you can look at Sri Lanka, you can look at many of the countries that I mentioned in that regard to give you illustrations of that. Good question, Sophia.
Thank you. Thanks for your response.
Emma?
Hello. So my question deals with in the beginning when you were saying that you don't really use Western policies, you use international laws. Could you further explain or expand on the importance of cultural knowledge and, maybe an anthropological history when going into a job like this or any government job, and possibly like the dangers of Eurocentric values?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, Emma. Uh, I'm not going to talk about any government job. We'll just talk about mine. Just back from, as I indicated at the beginning, there's quite a bit of travel associated with our work. So I'm just back from a mission to Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan is a predominantly Muslim country, but it's also a former a republic that was formerly part of the Soviet Union, and so it has this interesting mix of things. It has that old Soviet notion that there's something wrong about religion and that therefore the state has to be secular, while at the same time it has a Muslim population. Not only that, it's right next door to Iran and right next door to Turkey. And so these are places, Iran and Turkey, where a strong Islamic resurgence and frankly, in the case of Iran, a fairly radical version of Islam is ascendant. And so here is this country kind of caught in between. I had to, to make my determinations about how their laws work and whether they're measuring up to the standards of international law in regards to religious freedom. I had to get to know that culture. I had to understand the history. I had to, understand that it came from the former Soviet Union. I had to understand the kind of Islam that has been long practiced in that territory. And so your question is right on the money. In order to make sense of the situation that religious freedom is facing in any particular concrete place that we encountered around the world, you really do have to understand that cultural context, that political context, that historical context in which it's taking place. Otherwise, you can't make sense of it, I don't think. So it's critically important to have that knowledge and to work to get that knowledge, because you just don't come in to a job knowing, well, the history of Azerbaijan or the Islamic culture of Azerbaijan. This is something you have to work at to get.
Thank you so much for that response.
Thank you. Hi, Nathan.
Hello. I want to thank you again for being here and able to talk with us today. It was really interesting, all the information you gave. But my question pertains to, you discussed multiple times the Uyghur Muslims in China, especially Xinjiang. You used the term genocide and cultural genocide to describe the current treatment of the Uyghur Muslims. What exactly it constitutes what is happening with the Uyghur Muslims to qualify for the legal framework that is genocide, as well as what has the international global community done to address this?
Right. First of all, I want to say, before my time, but it was the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom that really pushed the United States government to kind of make the determination that it did of the Uyghur genocide that's occurring there. And, to explain the situation, the Uyghur population in China is tremendously controlled, surveilled by the state. They maintain what are, in effect, concentration camps for large numbers of Uyghurs, not all Uyghurs, but large numbers of Uyghurs in Western China. And the conditions in these concentration camps, by all reports, are absolutely horrible. The concern I think that the Chinese government has is that the Uyghur religion, that Islam, and the Uyghur identity, in some sense, fundamentally gives this population an appeal to some authority outside of the control of the Communist Party of China. And that outside appeal is what frightens them. They're afraid that there is going to be a consciousness raising among the Uyghur population, which will lead them to be in tension with the communist government. And so it's utter totalitarianism in the way that the Uyghur population is treated. And as I said, it's a cultural genocide as well. So they do all sorts of things to erase Uyghur culture. You know, a good illustration of this is to look at what they have done to some of the mosques in Western China. They've taken these mosques that were originally, you know, the way that we imagine most mosques in our mind to be, looking like something out of the Middle East with minarets and dome and, you know, the usual sort of way one would imagine a mosque to look at. But they have turned them into, architecturally, they have redone them, and in some places, destroyed them and rebuilt them in ways so that they look Chinese rather than Uyghur, so that they erase the Muslim Uyghur part of the identity of these people and replace it with architecture that is Han Chinese. That's a good illustration, I think, of the cultural side, as well as I said before, the other side of the genocide that's occurring there. So it's really a horrible situation for the Uyghurs, and at the moment, I'm not seeing much leverage that the West is able to apply to help the Uyghurs in the midst of this repression. Good question, though.
I also had another question. You mentioned how the large spike in religious persecution around the globe is strongly linked with the weakening of democracy. Is there any other factors that follow this, such as the increased usage of social media worldwide, more interconnected, easier ability to spread ideology? And if so, what are those other factors?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the things that we're tracking is the use of social media to accelerate and amplify hate speech around the world. And just as you all know, that hate speech, grows like mushrooms, in Facebook, X, whatever. I mean, we see it here in the United States, just in our own feeds. Around the world, this is oftentimes used as a way to amplify religious discrimination and religious persecution, and, particularly in countries where there's relatively open internet, to be honest with you. And so India, Pakistan, much of South Asia, which populations that are just as internet savvy as we are here in the United States, social media is the principal way in which a great deal of this discrimination is mobilized. For example, the Hindu riots against Muslims and Christians in India over the last number of years. These riots are often instigated on Instagram or on Facebook. So it's tremendously concerning. And I should say, although this is a slightly different category, we're also following carefully the use of artificial intelligence as a way of advancing this kind of discrimination and persecution, and very concerned about what we're seeing there. We're also concerned slightly differently about the use of artificial intelligence by some of these worst nations in order to control their population's religious beliefs and views. Emma.
Just to go off that question, do you think about any of like the pros of social media that maybe we're able to get firsthand accounts of these crises, or maybe it's able for, students like us to be advocates and to share like personal stories and to share our thoughts on it?
I'm not quite sure I've got the entire question, so let me just say, if you're asking, are there ways that we can identify the emergence of this kind of persecution and discrimination? Yes, there's a there's a wonderful project that the Holocaust Museum here in Washington has underway to create an early warning system for genocide. Now, this isn't just focused on religion, but obviously religion is part of it. But I'm very encouraged by the work that they're doing in this regard. And yes, they're exactly using social media as one of the principal places that they're looking to identify where the kind of expressions and speech, hate speech and so forth, is rising that might be a telltale sign of potential threat of genocidal violence and so forth. So people, we don't do that. Obviously, we use social media quite a bit to for our own communications, and obviously we study what's available, what's put on the web by countries and organizations and so forth to assess whether it's indication of religious discrimination or persecution. But we're not doing the kind of thing that the Holocaust Museum is doing, and I think there needs to be more of that. We need to develop better mechanisms to identify online where these kinds of threats are rising, not just genocide, but threats to religious freedom generally. So I agree. And your second question, I think, was about what you can do, and I'm not quite sure what you had in mind there.
Yeah, I just think as, students or young people who want to be advocates, I think I personally see this a lot on social media. And obviously it is like my peers and other young people, posting things and posting firsthand accounts of these instances of, not only religious persecution, but other types of persecution just to get the word out. Do you think, that is a good way of spreading messages? Do you think that aims on like performative?
I think it's critical that all of us push back whenever we see these kinds of things occurring, whenever we see hate speech occurring, in regards to religion, to push back on it, discriminatory speech to push back on it. If we don't push back, remember there are no government entities that push back anymore. Essentially, they've been sidelined over the last couple of years, and so I think that it's on all of us to police what we see in regards to hate speech and incitements for persecution and discrimination. I think we have to call it out. So I applaud any young person that's willing to take on that. It can be very unpopular, and you risk becoming a target yourself. But I think that it is important we push back if we can.
Thank you.
Sophia.
Just to touch on what Nathaniel mentioned about genocide and the abolition of certain religions, have you, in your experience at the commission, ever seen a niche religion go extinct, and what were the implications of that on the community as a whole? And like Emma mentioned, is there anything that students can do to kind of prevent these actions or bring it to light in some type of way so that it doesn't go unseen? Especially, we're in a very individualistic hustle and bustle society, especially in New York. How do we get people to care about these issues before it turns to abolishment of religion or extinction?
Right. That's touching on a very troubling subject. So while we haven't seen religions exactly erased, we have seen and are monitoring religions that are so horribly repressed that they're tremendously diminished. One example of this would be the Yazidi community in Iraq and Syria. First, the Yazidis, were very much pressured and constrained by the government of Saddam Hussein when it ruled Iraq. But then when ISIS came to power, they specifically attacked the Yazidi communities. These were small communities to begin with, and largely decimated the population. They took the women and forced them to convert to Islam and forced them to become wives of ISIS fighters. They killed the men and the boys. And as a result, the Yazidi religion is kind of on life support at the moment. The international community has done quite a bit to try to protect the Yazidis and try to restore them to some of the territories that they've been pushed out. But the sort of damage that's been done is just astonishing. Likewise, you could say that the efforts on the part of the Myanmar regime to exclude, to push the Muslim Rohingya from Myanmar has largely succeeded in ending in erasing the Muslim population within the country. There are more than 1.5 million refugees have been pushed from the country, but within the country there's just only a small footprint left of the Muslim population that was there before. Of course, historically, the example of what Hitler did to the Jews in the Second World War is, I don't know. I'm without words describing, what occurred there. But small minority religions, when they're under pressure of these large majority religions with government support, can be really in danger. There are very few Jews left in Iran. It was once a country with a fairly large Jewish population. There are hardly any left. There are, so you begin to see the pattern. So it can occur, but I'm not aware of any place that's truly successfully eliminated religion within their territory, but it's come pretty close in a number of cases.
Thank you.
Megan, do we have time for more?
We have time for one or two more questions.
Okay, go for it, Nathaniel.
My question was in regards to, we talked about how there's been a large spike in countries with weakening democracies, but my other question was in regards to certain questions about within states that are widely considered more stronger democracies, especially policies that have been implemented by the state, such as in France, the banning of women wearing religious head wearing. Also, not as strong of a democracy, but on regards to the Rohingya, policies implemented by the Aung San Suu Kyi administration, and whether are we paying enough attention to globally policies of religious persecution in countries that are not just countries with weakening democracies?
Yeah, I love that question. That's a really good one. Well, I will say that we are increasingly concerned about the situation about the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bias in Europe, and it's very concerning to see the way in which both of those forms of discrimination and persecution have spiked in Europe. In particular, you mentioned France. Both of these are evidence in France, and France's efforts to control it. France has this agency within the government whose job is to basically, keep religion under wraps, so that it doesn't become, a source of internal conflict. Unfortunately, the result are things like the anti-hijab law in France, and not just anti-hijab law, but anti-religious garb in general law that includes everything from Jewish ritual garb to Christian religious garb. So it's a very very much a concern. that kind of enforced secularism, in France it's called laïcité, that kind of enforced secularism can be a threat to religion too. We can't forget that. But beyond that, the spiking anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bias that you see is particularly noticeable in the eastern part of Europe. So Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, the Balkans, even Austria, and unfortunately, even in places like Germany, you're seeing a real spike of that, and you're seeing political parties take advantage of that and begin to organize around those lines of discrimination, like the AfD in Germany, for example, is an illustration of that. So it's a concern, very much a concern. And you're right, we should pay more attention to it than we do. I would argue the world in general needs to pay much more attention to freedom of religion everywhere. But yes, we cannot forget the kinds of examples that you made.
Thank you.
Could I jump in with one question of my own then, Stephen? Bringing it back to your biography as a political philosopher, and just a lot of this, there seems to be a real, which you've said sort of directly, this relationship between freedom of religion and democracy, and that, but not a kind of secularization, right? Like you're not arguing for, like you say, like laicite and secularism as a dominant form, but really for the ability of people to be themselves authentically as spiritual people in a democracy. And I just get you to talk a little bit more about that relationship between democracy and religion as a more, I think we often see it as something that needs to be separated, but there's something there that also needs to be sort of tied together, it seems.
Yeah, thanks for that, Fred. And I said I wasn't going to talk about the United States, but maybe I could just talk a little bit about the United States here. So, one of my formative texts for thinking about the relationship between religion and democracy is the lifelong exchange of letters between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And in that wonderfully rich exchange of letters over the course of their lives, remember, they both die on the same day in 1826, I guess it is, July 4th, if I remember correctly, on 1826. So long life that both of those gentlemen had. And the exchange of letters between them is so rich, in part, I think, because they recognize the link between the freedom to believe and to make sense of the world according to what is deepest and truest and most sacred within you. They connect that to the viability of Republican democratic government itself. These things can't somehow be separated. There has to be that freedom to be inspired by the truths that are the most important to you. That has to be there for democracy to work. And when that's not, then democracy withers and democracy dies. So so I really do believe there is exactly that connection that you're talking about, Fred. And I'd go so far as to say that I think enforced secularization, like French laïcité, I mean, if particularly imagine that on steroids, that would not, I think, ultimately be all that conducive for democratic government.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a need for people to believe, right? Like there's something.
There needs to be that, there needs to be that space, whether you choose to be an atheist or, a Mormon, there needs to be that space in order to make those choices. And if there isn't, then I think that democracy can't fully function.
Megan?
So just to kind of one raise one thing, again, because we are here at St. John's University, a Catholic university. One of the things I just wanted to ask if you could say a minute, a little bit for a minute, about why religious freedom is a value for Catholics, and it is a value within Catholic social teaching. Around the same, not that long after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we get Dignitatis Humanae at Vatican II, and an American plays a big role in that, in John Courtney Murray.
Right.
But I think as a final question on here, as an expert yourself, to say something on religious freedom and what it means for Catholics and for Catholic social teaching, not just for that democracy needs it as a good thing, but we believe all humans do.
Absolutely. I think the great insight of Dignitatis Humanae, which is, one of my favorite documents coming out of the of Vatican II. I think that one of the greatest insights is this recognition that same freedom for that space that I just described, having that freedom allows you to bring a kind of a depth and a richness to your faith that otherwise wouldn't be there. If your faith isn't something that you freely choose, that comes out of your own best efforts to make sense of the world, then your faith is diminished. If your faith is something that is just habit, if your faith is something that's been imposed on you, then ultimately it doesn't have the kind of depth that the Gospels are all about. And so, I think that's the great insight of Dignitatis, and I'm glad you mentioned that. One of the areas that you and I overlap with a little bit, Megan. I completely agree. It really is critical, I think, for our Catholic faith. And when I hear occasional Catholics now these days talking with suspicion about religious freedom, I go back to that initial insight from Dignitatis and John Courtney Murray, who principal author of that document.
For the students who likely do not know this, and for anyone who watches the webinar, it is precisely the American understanding of religious freedom and democracy brought by Father John Courtney Murray as an advisor to the Second Vatican Council that provides the Catholic Church with an example of religious freedom as a value and as a good, and a diversity in a community as a value and a good that doesn't lead to the French Revolution and the guillotine, and the remnants of that we still see in France today with these laws.
Right.
I want to thank our wonderful students
Me too.
for their insightful questions and comments. Thank you to Fred for moderating, and my utmost thanks to Dr. Steve Schneck for being willing to share his perspective and work and wisdom with us. I know this was an incredibly clear webinar and is going to provide a valuable resource in so many different classes once we get it up on YouTube. And for everyone else, please also join us in April, on April 11th, when we will have our next webinar, which will be looking at the situation in South Africa, the global refugee crisis, and the current state of these questions for U.S. politics. So suddenly we've got a spotlight on South Africa in the midst of the U.S.'s problematic halting of all refugee programs. And so we will have with us Father Peter Knox from South Africa, Joan Rosenhauer, who's retired from Jesuit Refugee Services, and Dr. Anna Flerke-Scheid from Duquesne, who's an expert on Christian nationalism and political theology here in the United States. So hopefully you all can join us then as well. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Pleasure.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you so much.
Great day.
Take care.